I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're 82 years old, 82 being the average life expectancy of men and women in Canada. And when you're 82 years old, if you thought about it for a moment, you'd realize that the amount of time you've left, well, it's growing short. And when things come to an end, like a relationship, a job, your time in university, or for sure your life, it's natural to reflect back and think, was it really worth it? And when you're 82 years old, reflecting back on your life, in particular the career section of your life, your thinking might take one of two paths. It might go like this. Yep, I had a pretty good career. I did interesting work. I was given lots of opportunity to grow and learn. I was always proud of the organizations that I worked for. I respected my bosses and my coworkers. They were great as well. Many have become great friends. I had a nice balance between my home life and work. And sure, I would have liked to have made more money, but I was adequately paid for what I did. I'd give that kind of an A-, B+ sort of grade. Actually, 82-year-olds are not as anal as students about marks, just so you know. Or your thinking might go down a second path. Something like this. You know what? I spent 40 years doing that, half my life. I remember getting a pit in my stomach every Sunday night thinking about going to work on Monday morning. And I lived for the weekend. By far, my favorite day of the week was Friday. I couldn't stand my bosses and my coworkers. They weren't any better. And I remember that cartoon I saw once where a bunch of factory workers were going into a plant and punching their time cards, and there was a big sign there that said, "Remember, check your brain at the door." That reminded me of me. My work was so boring. But what could I do? I had mouths to feed, mortgages to pay. And then I turned 40, and I knew my desire for a great career was gone, because I had all those years of pensionable service accumulated. How could I leave now? And that's when I started counting down the days to retirement. Yep, back then, 25 years times 365 days didn't seem like that much. I even bought one of those big wall calendars. Every day at 4:30 when I left, I put a big X, another day gone. Did that 9,120 times, and then I retired. Unfortunately, there are a lot more people like that than you think. I read a lot of personal growth books. One I keep close by is this one, 5 Secrets You Must Discover Before You Die by Dr. John Izzo. And in the book, Izzo talks a lot about regret that people have at the end of life. And he and other researchers have concluded that you will not regret the things you may have tried and failed at, but you will regret the things you always wanted to do but never did. So I've been very curious about that, given my profession as a recruiter and a career coach. Why do people have regret about career at the end of life? And to me, it boils down to a 4-letter word. It's fear. And in fact, most of you in this room, if you're like your parents and others before you, you will lead what I call a fear-based career, meaning that most of your actions and your decisions throughout your life will be governed by some underlying fear that prevents you from achieving the things that you want to achieve. So I wanted to learn more about this. I sent an email note out to our email list a couple of months ago, told them I was doing this TED Talk on fear, and I asked for some examples of how fears have held you back. In the few minutes we have today, I want to share some of their stories with you. First person I want to tell you about is Jennifer. Jennifer is actually a professional accountant in her late 30s now. Jennifer grew up in less than stellar circumstances. Her father was an alcoholic. Her mother held a series of menial jobs. They were in a rural community. The family had a personal bankruptcy in the past, so they experienced economic hardship. To her credit, Jennifer told me that at age 16, she decided that she didn't want to be like her mother. She knew that if she stayed where she was and did nothing, she'd be working her whole life at the gas station or at the convenience store. So without family support, she came to the city, applied for university, got into a business program, did well, learned she liked accounting. When she graduated, she joined a small CA firm, did her normal studies. And then it came time to write what are called the uniform final exams. Now, the uniform final exams are national exams written by professional accountants, very rigorous exams. In fact, they're so rigorous that only 1 in 2 people who write the exam actually pass. And many professional accountants take 2, 3, 4 times before they actually pass. But Jennifer passed on her first try. And to this day, 15 years later, she still believes that was a fluke. She thinks the marker made a mistake. So I asked her why. She told me that because, like her mother, she believes deeply that she's not worthy of success. And I asked her further to explain that. I asked her how it has impacted her career, that not feeling worthy of success. She told me how she's behind career-wise, right behind her peers, because she doesn't apply for jobs that she would be qualified for, thinking she's not going to get the job. When she does apply, her self-doubt and lack of confidence shows through. She performs well and doesn't get the job, kind of confirming her first point. Salary-wise, she's making far less money than her peers, mostly because she's reluctant to ask for raises along the way. And she even told me that at one point she was looking for some performance feedback from her boss, but she couldn't bring herself to ask her boss for a meeting because she was afraid of what the boss was going to say to her. So Jennifer, to her credit, I mean, she's a pretty dogged person. She's going to struggle her whole life. She's come across some strategies that are mitigating some of these fears, but I suspect she will struggle with this her whole life. Next person I want to tell you about is Joe. Joe has an ordinarily high fear of being judged by others. So Joe, like Jennifer, is a well-qualified person. He's a marine biologist, a master's in environmental science. He worked 10 years with an environmental consulting firm. And unfortunately, because of the industry downturn, Joe lost his job. This was really only his only job after graduation. And he's out there being interviewed. And he has this very high level of interview anxiety that's impairing his performance. Now, being anxious in interviews is normal, but if it carries on too far, it's problematic. So one thing, what Joe was very concerned about, he told me when we met, that he's afraid of looking stupid. You know, they think he's not qualified and he won't get the job. It's this equation that he's working through. So what he does to prepare for interviews, he told me, he anticipates every question he's going to be asked, writes down word for word all of his answers to get ready. Now, that's not a bad strategy. But the problem is when Joe gets in the interview, if he gets off script a little bit, forgets what he's supposed to say, or if he's asked a question that he hasn't anticipated, he panics, essentially. So he doesn't have strategies built up to be composed, calm, and not panic. So in his interviews, he told me he's stilted, he's structured, his authentic self is not coming through, and he doesn't get hired for the jobs. I spoke to Jacqueline, too. Jacqueline's a very seasoned media relations, public relations, communications specialist. She advises senior-level business people, government people, elected officials, politicians on high-level policy matters and strategic matters. They appreciate her advice. She gives good advice. But she told me that when she hears that being conveyed in the public forum, such as in press conferences or in the newspapers and other media releases, she begins to doubt herself. And she has what she has self-diagnosed or defined as what she calls unsubstantiated influence. I thought that was a clinical term at first, but it turns out Jacqueline's issue is that, she has 5 years of university education, but she doesn't have a degree. She doesn't actually think she's smart enough to be giving advice to people who are more qualified than her. She went on to explain a situation where this really arose about a year ago. She was working for a politician who was running for election. She gave him some advice, and he spoke about it publicly. Got picked up in the media and was heavily criticized in the media. So normally communications people are behind the scenes, they're unnamed and unmentioned. But in this case, the reporter picked up Jacqueline's name and kept illustrating that, in fact, she didn't have the qualifications. So she couldn't actually stand the ridicule and the embarrassment. She quit her job. She went into a shell. She's been actually unemployed for a year, and she's now applying for jobs as receptionist because, quote unquote, they are safe. No one can actually ridicule me in these jobs. Even employers are asking when she applies for these jobs, why? Like, you're well qualified based on your experience. Why are you applying for these jobs? And she told me she lies to them. She lies to them. She basically says it's an easier commute, better work-life balance, and so on. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with Jacqueline. I learned about Cory. Cory was a mid-40s vice president of distribution for a print media newspaper company. He'd been there for about 10 years, had a great job. He was making about $200,000 a year. And that industry went through some downsizing. Also, he lost his job. And Cory could not accept the fact that he was fired. Because his whole status and identity was tied up in his job. He didn't tell anybody, or he told very few people that he'd actually lost his job, which is not a smart strategy when you're looking for work, when you should be as widespread as possible. He would only apply for jobs that were at his old level or above. And he had received a severance package, and he had some savings. But what happened, since he also didn't change his lifestyle, he still belonged to all the clubs and so on, that he blew through his savings in 3 years. And so he now is about 50 years of age, broke, living in his parents' basement. So his whole status, identity, was tied up in his work. There were many jobs that he didn't even apply for that would have paid, they were good jobs, $125 or $150. But he couldn't bring himself because his whole identity was tied up in his work. There were many others. There was Linda, who always feels a sense of powerlessness. The root of that primarily is, I think, in her childhood, where her father was, she told me, very verbally abusive and belittling to her. And even though she's mid-career now, well qualified, has an MBA, and has held some fairly senior jobs, anytime she has a boss who's a bit more aggressive than they should be, she backs off, feels powerless, that things are going to be taken from her. There's Brian, who's had about 50 years of age, had a whole career in business development and sales. He's only recently discovered this about himself. He's had an average career, performance-wise, but he's discovered this, that he feels sales is a disreputable profession, even though he's doing it. He's actually ashamed of what he's doing. There's Julie, who's a director of human resources for an organization, was invited to sit at the leadership table with the president and the owner and the vice presidents all the time, and although she's only a director. But whenever conversation got to a level that she didn't understand or couldn't comprehend, she wondered why she was there. She was feeling like an imposter. And in fact, she told me that the president said, I'm happy to promote you to vice president of human resources, but she declined that offer, saying, I'm not quite ready yet. And there's Alan, who's had a very, very successful career in retail store management. His stores are always hit their sales targets and achieve their profitability targets, yet he's got a very, very high level of fear of being fired at all times. There are a lot of these stories, but I want to leave you with this question. Are you going to let your fears prevent you from achieving your career potential? And as you contemplate your answer, I'd ask you to consider 3 things. First, how you define career potential, it's totally up to you. You own the definition, not your parents, not your bosses, not your peers, you. You might define career potential as making a lot of money, working for a big company. You might define it as working for a not-for-profit in a third world country. You might define it as working a regular 9-to-5 job where you can leave your worries at the office so your evenings and weekends are your own. It doesn't matter. One definition is not better than the other. Many of you in the room are early in your career, so you may not have that definition identified yet, but please start to work on it before others define it for you. The second point is about your fears. Look, you have fears, I have fears, we all have fears. Even people who we think are fearless have fears. The question is, what are we going to do about them? So like some of the people that I mentioned here, acknowledging your fears is an important step. Identifying in particular how those fears are impacting your life and your career, and then developing some strategies to overcome them is important. And the final point is, I'd like to bring you back to your 82-year-old self. You don't want to be that person who has regrets at the end of life. When you're 82, it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely that you're going to write that book, start that company, or go for that job. Remember, there's a great temptation to play it safe through your life. It's familiar, it's secure, it's comfortable. but you will regret the risks you never took. So please, be courageous, deal with your fears, leave no regrets. Thank you.